The man in the photograph wears a simple military tunic, his mustache neatly trimmed, his eyes revealing nothing. He does not smile. He never smiled in photographs, understood that power required distance, that the leader of a vast empire should appear carved from stone rather than flesh. Behind him, unseen in the frame but present in every line of his face, lie the bodies of millions. Peasants starved in engineered famines, intellectuals shot in basement prisons. Entire populations were deported to wastelands where survival was unlikely and return impossible. His name was Joseph Stalin, and he transformed the Soviet Union from a backward agricultural nation into an industrial superpower. And the cost of that transformation was paid in human suffering so vast, it still defies complete comprehension. But before he was Stalin, the man of steel, before he became the dictator whose paranoia would consume even his closest allies, before he built the system that would murder millions in the name of building socialism, he was Iosif Jughashvili, a boy in Georgia who loved poetry and studied for the priesthood, whose childhood was marked by poverty and violence, whose early years gave no clear indication that he would become one of history's most brutal tyrants. The distance between that boy and the monster he became is the subject of our exploration tonight. Not to excuse or explain away the inexcusable, but to understand how human beings, not fundamentally different from ourselves, become capable of crimes that should be unthinkable. This is not a comfortable story. There will be no redemption here, no moment when the darkness lifts to reveal hidden goodness. Stalin died believing he had been right, that the millions who died had been necessary sacrifices to a greater purpose, that history would vindicate his methods even if his contemporaries condemned them. He was wrong, but understanding why he believed himself justified, how he rationalized atrocity, how a system of total control was built through bureaucratic procedure as much as through violence. These things matter not just for understanding the past, but for recognizing the dangers that persist wherever power concentrates without accountability, wherever ideology replaces humanity, wherever the end is allowed to justify any means. Tonight we trace this terrible arc from poverty in Gori to absolute power in the Kremlin, from seminary student to revolutionary to dictator, watching how each transformation built on the previous one, how the skills learned in underground organizing became tools for purging enemies, how the determination to industrialize the Soviet Union became justification for engineered famine, how the fear of invasion became excuse for paranoia that murdered innocents by the millions. This is the unforgivable life, and we begin as all lives begin with a child who did not yet know what he would become. Before we descend into this darkest of biographies, a gentle request. If these explorations of history's most difficult figures help you understand how evil operates at the scale of states and systems, if they provide the understanding we need to recognize danger before it fully manifests, consider allowing this channel to remain part of your nightly reflections. A subscription, a like, these small acts help others find their way to these necessary, if uncomfortable, examinations of power and its abuses, and share with us in the comments below which other figures, which other dark chapters you believe deserve this kind of careful, sober analysis? Now settle into the quiet hours. What follows is not easy, but it is important. We are about to meet a man who would shape the 20th century through violence and will, who would prove that revolution could betray itself, that socialism could become totalitarian, that human life could be treated as raw material for projects that crushed individuals beneath the weight of historical necessity. Let us begin. The town of Gori sat in a valley where the Kura River moved slowly between mountains that had watched empires rise and fall for millennia. Georgia was old in ways that Russia, which claimed dominion over it, was not. Its culture reaching back before Christianity, its language unrelated to any surrounding it, its people fiercely proud of traditions the Russian Empire viewed with the casual contempt that colonizers reserve for those they have conquered. It was here, in a two-room house that could barely contain the poverty and violence that filled it, that Iose Bessarionis Zhetjugashvili was born on December 18th, 1878, the third child and first to survive infancy, arriving in a world that would teach him lessons about power and cruelty that he would never forget and never forgive. His father, Bessarion, known as Beso, was a cobbler whose small workshop represented his only claim to independence, to being something more than a peasant bound to land and lord. They were forbidden secular literature, forbidden contact with the outside world beyond what the church approved, subjected to constant surveillance and petty restrictions that seemed designed to break independent thought and create obedient servants of orthodoxy. Soso responded by reading everything forbidden. The seminary had a thriving black market in banned books, texts smuggled in by students who understood that prohibition created rather than prevented interest, that the young men locked away from the world would seek that world through whatever means available. He read Russian novels, French philosophy, and most importantly, the works that were beginning to circulate among disaffected youth across the empire, the writings of Marx and Engels, the revolutionary literature that explained the world's injustices not as divine will or natural order, but as the result of specific economic and political arrangements that could be changed through human action. The transformation was not immediate. Soso did not wake one morning as a committed Marxist, did not experience a sudden conversion that replaced religious faith with ideological certainty. Instead, the change happened gradually, idea by idea, each new text adding to a worldview that was forming, each discussion with fellow students revealing that others shared his questions and his anger, that the suffering he had witnessed in his childhood and the poverty that surrounded him were not isolated phenomena but patterns that connected to larger systems of exploitation and oppression. He began to see history not as the unfolding of a divine plan, but as the story of class struggle, of the powerful exploiting the powerless through mechanisms that could be analyzed and understood and crucially overthrown. The religious framework that had promised justice in the next life gave way to a secular framework that promised justice in this one, that demanded action rather than patient suffering, that transformed rage at injustice from sin into revolutionary virtue. By 17, He was more involved in revolutionary circles than in his studies. He joined a secret Marxist study group, read illegal newspapers, and participated in strikes and demonstrations that were becoming more frequent as industrialization reached even peripheral cities like Tiflis. The seminary authorities noticed his increasing insubordination, the way he challenged teachers and ignored rules, and the books they kept finding hidden in his possessions despite repeated confiscations and punishments. In 1899, he was expelled officially for missing exams, actually for the revolutionary activities that had made him too dangerous to keep in an institution training servants of the church and state. The expulsion freed him to commit fully to the life he had already half entered, the underground existence of the professional revolutionary who lived between cities and identities, who supported himself through party work and occasional criminal activity that was justified as expropriating the expropriators, who burned with certainty that the old world deserved to be destroyed and that he would be among those wielding the torch. Kiki was devastated. All her sacrifices, all the floors she had scrubbed and the clothes she had washed, had been aimed at making her son a priest, at lifting him into respectable society. Instead, he had become something that terrified her, a revolutionary who would spend his life hunted by police, who had traded the possibility of security for the certainty of danger, who had rejected her dreams for him in favor of dreams she could not understand, and that frightened her with their violence and their absolutism. But Soso, who was beginning to use other names now, Koba after a Georgian folk hero, and eventually Stalin, was unmoved by her tears. He had discovered something that gave meaning to the suffering he had endured and witnessed, a framework that explained why the world was unjust, and a method for making it just, a cause that was worth any sacrifice because it promised to redeem all suffering by ending the systems that caused it. The poetry stopped. The emotional expressiveness that had characterized his youth hardened into the controlled, calculating demeanor that would mark his maturity. The lessons of his childhood were being refined into revolutionary practice. Violence worked. He had learned that from his father's fists. Sentiment was weak. His mother's devotion had not saved them from poverty. Power was all that mattered, and power came to those willing to do what others would not, to those hard enough to endure and inflict suffering without being moved by it. The boy who had written romantic poetry about Georgian mountains was becoming the man who would use mountains of corpses as stepping stones to absolute power. Yet, even in this transformation, there were elements that would persist, the resentment of those born to privilege. But independence was fragile when built on craft alone, vulnerable to the mechanization that was beginning to reach even peripheral corners of the empire, to the factory made shoes that cost less and lasted longer than anything a village cobbler could produce. Bezos' business failed slowly, and with each setback he drank more, his frustration seeking an outlet in the only targets available, his wife and his son, the people who depended on him and could not escape. The beatings were regular enough to become routine, unpredictable enough to create constant tension. Young Soso, as the boy was called, learned to watch his father's mood, to read the signs that indicated whether today would bring violence or the possibility of peace. He learned that the world was divided into those who had power and those who suffered under it, that the strength mattered more than justice, that pleading accomplished nothing, while endurance at least preserved some shred of dignity. These were not lessons taught through words but through the body, through pain that left bruises and broke bones and created in the child a hardness that would never soften, a conviction that sentiment was weakness, and that survival required becoming someone who could neither be hurt nor moved by the hurting of others. His mother, Ekaterine, called Keki, was different but no less formative. She was a washerwoman whose hands were permanently reddened from the lye soap she used to clean other people's clothes, whose back ached from bending over washtubs, who took in sewing at night to supplement the meager income that kept them just barely above starvation. But Keke possessed something that Bezo had lost, or perhaps never had, a fierce belief that her son was destined for something better than the poverty that surrounded them. She saw his intelligence, noticed how quickly he learned, how he absorbed the stories she told him of Georgian heroes and saints, how his eyes burned with an intensity that suggested inner life beyond what his circumstances should have allowed. She wanted him to become a priest. In the Russian Empire's complex social hierarchy, the Orthodox Church offered one of the few paths by which a peasant boy might rise, might achieve education and respectability, and escape the grinding poverty that claimed most who were born into it. Keke scrubbed floors and washed clothes and saved every kopeck she could toward the school fees that would give Soso this chance, this possibility of transformation that she pursued with religious devotion, seeing in her son's potential a kind of redemption for all that she had endured. When Beso discovered this plan, he raged. His son would not become a priest, would not rise above his father through education and soft hands that had never known real work. If the boy was to amount to anything, it would be as a cobbler, learning his father's trade, continuing the family craft that Beso still claimed despite the evidence that this craft was dying. The fight between Keke and Beso over Soso's future was violent and decisive. Keke won, not through superior strength, but through superior will, through her willingness to endure anything to secure her son's future, through her appeal to relatives and church authorities who sided with her against the drunken cobbler whose workshop had already failed. At 10, Soso entered the church school in Gori, beginning the education that would separate him from his father's world forever. He was a brilliant student, excelling in languages and history, showing a memory that could absorb vast amounts of information and recall it with precision. He also showed a different kind of intelligence, a capacity for manipulation and organization that made him a natural leader among his peers, someone who could inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure, who understood instinctively how to identify what people wanted and use that knowledge to control them. He wrote poetry during these years, romantic verses in Georgian that celebrated the beauty of his homeland, that expressed emotions he would later learn to suppress entirely. The poetry was genuinely skilled, good enough to be published in local journals, showing a sensitivity and aesthetic sense that seemed incompatible with the hard, cold figure he would become. But perhaps this was not a contradiction but a foundation. Perhaps the ability to feel deeply was what made necessary the armor that would eventually seal off feeling entirely. The recognition that emotion was vulnerability, and vulnerability was unacceptable in a world that punished weakness without mercy. At 14, he won a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, the most prestigious religious school in Georgia, a place that trained priests, but that also, inadvertently, trained revolutionaries. The seminary's education was rigorous, its discipline severe, its atmosphere oppressive in ways that bred rebellion among the more intelligent students. The chip on the shoulder of someone from the periphery who would spend his life among revolutionaries from the center, from Moscow and St. Petersburg, who had never known poverty like his poverty, violence like his violence, the suspicion of intellectuals who lived in their heads, while he had learned in his body, the conviction that those who had not suffered as he had suffered could not be trusted to see the revolution through, that their commitment would falter when the costs became clear. Stalin was not yet Stalin. He was just one of hundreds of young revolutionaries scattered across the Russian Empire, most of whom would die in exile or execution, whose names would be forgotten, who would amount to nothing beyond their small contributions to a movement that seemed doomed to perpetual marginality against the vast repressive apparatus of the Tsarist state. Nothing about the young man leaving the seminary suggested he would rise above his comrades, would survive when so many fell, would eventually command power that his teenage self could not have imagined even in his most grandiose fantasies. But the elements were in place. The hardness learned from surviving Bezos' fists, the determination absorbed from Kiki's will, the intelligence that had made him the best student in every school he attended, the capacity for organization and manipulation that made him a natural, if uncharismatic, leader, the absolute conviction that the cause justified any means, that sentiment was bourgeois weakness, that the world would be remade through violence and will, and that those squeamish about methods would be swept aside by those committed to results. As he walked out of Tiflis into the underground life of the revolutionary, the future that awaited him was hidden, unknowable, a path that would wind through decades of police harassment and exile, through factional fights and robberies, through the chaos of revolution and the brutality of civil war, through the Byzantine politics of the party and the consolidation of power that would place him at the apex of one of the world's largest and most powerful states. That future contained millions of deaths, terrors that would make the Tsar's repressions seem almost gentle by comparison, crimes so vast they would define an era and haunt generations. But for now there was only the young man, 20 years old, carrying nothing but his anger and his conviction, walking toward a destiny that would consume him and millions of others, that would transform the Soviet Union and terrify the world, that would prove that poverty and violence in childhood do not excuse atrocity, but may help explain how humans become capable of it, how the abused sometimes become abusers on scales that dwarf the cruelties they endured, how suffering does not ennoble but can harden into something that views all suffering with cold indifference. The night settles over Gori, over the small house where Kika sits alone, her son gone into a life she cannot follow, her dreams for him replaced by fears she cannot speak. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, the young revolutionary moves toward a future that will darken the world, carrying with him the lessons of poverty and violence, transforming them into ideology and policy, becoming through slow increments something that the boy who wrote poetry could not have recognized, could not have believed himself capable of becoming, but becoming it nonetheless. And that transformation from Soso to Stalin, from victim to perpetrator on a scale almost beyond comprehension, is what we must now follow, not to excuse but to understand, not to forgive but to remember, because forgetting how such men are made leaves us vulnerable to making them again. The life of an underground revolutionary in the Russian Empire was one of constant movement and perpetual danger, of false names and midnight meetings, of knowing that every knock on the door might be police, that every comrade might be an informant, that the penalty for the work you were doing was Siberian exile or worse. Joseph Jughashvili, who would now call himself Koba after a Georgian outlaw hero, was born in 1899, joining the Tiflis branch of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and beginning 2 decades of clandestine activity that would forge him into something harder and more dangerous than the seminary student who had written romantic poetry just months before. The work was unglamorous and often tedious, printing illegal newspapers on presses that had to be hidden and moved constantly, organizing strikes among railway workers and factory hands, who risked everything by withdrawing their labor, conducting study circles where workers learned to read Marx and understand their exploitation not as a natural misfortune but as the result of specific economic arrangements that could be changed. Koba was good at this work, patient and methodical, showing none of the intellectual brilliance that characterized many revolutionary leaders, but possessing instead a practical competence that made him valuable to a movement that needed organizers as much as theorists. But there was another side to his revolutionary activity, one that revealed something darker about the man he was becoming. The party needed money, and legal fundraising was impossible for an organization that existed in the shadows and advocated the violent overthrow of the state. So funds were acquired through other means: bank robberies, euphemistically called expropriations, kidnappings of wealthy individuals whose families paid ransom, protection rackets run against businesses in Baku's oil fields. These activities were controversial within the party, with some leaders viewing them as banditry that discredited the revolutionary cause. But Lenin defended them as necessary, as justified means to the end of financing the revolution. Koba excelled at this criminal work. In 1907, he helped plan the Tiflis bank robbery, a daylight raid in the city's main square that netted the equivalent of millions of rubles and left dozens of casualties, guards, and bystanders caught in the crossfire and bombings that accompanied the robbery. The operation was militarily successful and politically disastrous, bringing intense police scrutiny and creating divisions within the party about whether such methods were acceptable. But it also demonstrated Koba's capacity for violence, his willingness to accept civilian casualties as acceptable costs. His ability to plan and execute operations that more squeamish revolutionaries could only theorize about. The police were never far behind. Koba was arrested for the first time in 1902, beginning a cycle that would repeat throughout the pre revolutionary period. Arrest, imprisonment, exile to Siberia, escape or release, return to revolutionary activity, and arrest again. He was sent to Siberia 7 times between 1902 and 1917, escaping 6 times, developing a reputation as someone who could endure the harsh conditions of exile and find ways to return to the fight. The experience hardened him further, taught him that suffering was survivable if you refused to let it break you, that the state's repression could be endured and evaded through patience and cunning. During these years of underground activity and exile, he observed the factional fights that were tearing Russian socialism apart. The party had split in 1903 into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, divisions that seemed arcane to outsiders but that mattered intensely to those involved. Questions about party organization and revolutionary strategy that masked deeper conflicts about power and personality. Lenin led the Bolsheviks, advocating a tight, disciplined party of professional revolutionaries. The Mensheviks wanted a broader, more democratic organization. Koba sided with Lenin, not from deep theoretical conviction but from practical assessment that Lenin's methods were more likely to succeed, that revolution required the kind of centralized control and ruthless efficiency that democratic processes would dilute. He met Lenin for the first time in 1905 at a party conference in Finland, and the encounter was formative. Lenin was everything Koba was not: an intellectual from a comfortable background, a man whose revolutionary commitment came from ideas rather than personal suffering, who spoke in complex theoretical formulations that sometimes lost his audience in their abstraction. But Lenin recognized in Koba something useful, someone who could do the dirty work without excessive moral qualms, who understood that revolution required not just correct theory, but people willing to execute that theory through whatever means necessary. Their relationship was never warm. Lenin valued Koba but did not particularly like him, found him crude and lacking in sophistication, someone useful for practical tasks, but not for theoretical development. Koba, for his part, recognized Lenin's genius but resented the easy authority that came from education and class background. The way other revolutionaries deferred to Lenin's judgment while questioning Koba's. This resentment would simmer for years, unspoken but present, contributing to the complex mix of loyalty and rivalry that would characterize Soviet politics after the revolution. In 1912, Lenin appointed Koba to the Bolshevik Central Committee, recognizing his organizational abilities and his reliability. It was around this time that he adopted the name Stalin, meaning man of steel, replacing the romantic Koba with something harder, more imposing, better suited to the image he wanted to project. The name was aspirational, a declaration of what he wanted to become: someone impervious to sentiment, unbending in purpose, strong enough to survive and triumph in the brutal competition that revolutionary politics had become. He was arrested again in 1913 and sent to Siberia, where he would remain for 4 years, the longest period of exile he endured. The isolation was nearly complete, the conditions harsh even by Siberian standards. The cold so severe it created a landscape that seemed designed to kill rather than merely imprison. But Stalin survived, as he always survived, finding ways to endure what broke others, developing a hatred for the intellectuals who dominated revolutionary leadership but who had never experienced the kind of suffering that exile represented, who theorized about hardship from comfortable European cafes while he froze in Siberian wasteland. The February Revolution of 1917 freed him, along with thousands of other political prisoners, releasing them into a Russia that was transforming with dizzying speed. The Tsar had abdicated. A provisional government struggled to maintain order while promising democracy and constitutional rights. And the Bolsheviks saw opportunity in the chaos, the possibility that their moment had finally arrived after decades of marginalized struggle. Stalin returned to Petrograd and immediately began consolidating his position within the party apparatus, working not at the level of grand speeches and theoretical debates, but at the unglamorous level of organization and control, appointing loyalists, managing the party newspaper, building the machinery of power that would matter more than oratory when the revolutionary moment arrived. He was not among the famous leaders of October 1917. While Lenin and Trotsky commanded public attention, while the storming of the Winter Palace entered revolutionary mythology, Stalin worked behind the scenes, coordinating logistics, ensuring that the party apparatus functioned, doing the administrative work that made revolution possible but that did not earn historical glory. This suited him. He had learned that visible leadership attracted attention and danger, that those who stood in spotlights became targets, that power could be accumulated more effectively through control of organizational machinery than through personal charisma. The civil war that followed the revolution from 1918 to 1921 was Stalin's finishing school in brutality. He was sent to various fronts as a political commissar, responsible for maintaining party control over military operations, for ensuring that commanders fought with sufficient ruthlessness, for executing deserters and suspected counter revolutionaries. He showed no mercy in this role, implemented policies of extreme violence against enemies real and imagined, demonstrated that he could make decisions that resulted in deaths by the thousands without visible hesitation or regret. At Tsaritsyn, the city that would later be renamed Stalingrad, he clashed with military professionals who wanted to fight the war according to traditional military principles. Stalin argued for ideological purity over military expertise, for trusting party loyalists over trained officers who had served the Tsar. He had the former Tsarist officers executed despite their willingness to serve the Red Army, believing that class background mattered more than competence, that revolution required purging all elements of the old regime regardless of their current utility. The results were mixed militarily, but demonstrated Stalin's willingness to prioritize ideological considerations over practical effectiveness, a trait that would characterize his entire rule. His relationship with Trotsky, who served as Commissar of War and was widely credited with organizing the Red Army victory in the Civil War, was poisonous from the start. Trotsky was everything Stalin resented: brilliant and charismatic, a gifted orator and writer, someone who commanded attention and respect through force of personality and intellectual firepower. Where Stalin worked in shadows, Trotsky stood in light. Where Stalin built power through organization, Trotsky wielded it through inspiration. The contrast grated on Stalin, fed his determination to outlast and ultimately destroy the man who represented everything he was not. But Stalin's method had advantages that Trotsky's brilliance could not match. While Trotsky made enemies through arrogance and ideological rigidity, Stalin built alliances through patience and political skill. While Trotsky published devastating critiques of opponents, Stalin quietly placed loyalists in key positions throughout the party bureaucracy. While Trotsky assumed that intellectual superiority would translate into political victory, Stalin understood that power came from controlling the machinery of organization, from knowing who owed you favors and who feared your displeasure, from building a network of dependence that would support you when conflicts became open. Lenin understood Stalin's nature, at least partially. In his final years, increasingly incapacitated by strokes, Lenin grew alarmed at Stalin's accumulation of power, at his rudeness and his brutality, at the way he treated comrades and the casual violence that characterized his approach to problems. In what became known as Lenin's Testament, dictated in late 1922 and early 1923, he suggested that Stalin should be removed from his position as general secretary, that he was too crude, too personally ambitious, too willing to abuse the power he had acquired. But the testament was suppressed, read only to a few party leaders who decided collectively not to publish it, in part because it criticized almost everyone and threatened to tear the party apart, in part because Stalin had already made himself too powerful to remove easily, had built the coalitions and accumulated the debts that meant opposing him carried costs that potential opponents were unwilling to pay. Lenin's warning went unheeded. The man who had seemed merely useful, merely crude but reliable, was positioning himself to inherit the revolution and transform it into something its founders would not recognize. Through all these years of revolutionary activity, of arrests and escapes, of factional fights and civil war, Stalin had been constructing the personality that would define him. The capacity for violence had been present since childhood, learned from his father's fists, and refined through criminal activity in the party's service. The organizational skill had been developed through years of underground work, learning to coordinate complex operations while evading police surveillance. The paranoia was partly justified by experience, by the constant awareness that any comrade might betray you, that trust was dangerous, that survival required assuming the worst about everyone. But there was something more, something that went beyond the reasonable suspicion that underground revolutionary activity required. Stalin was developing a worldview where enemies were everywhere, where loyalty was always temporary and contingent, and where even allies were potential threats, who needed to be controlled or eliminated before they could move against him. This paranoia would intensify as he gained power, would eventually consume even his closest supporters, and would create the Great Terror that murdered millions. But its roots were here, in these years of shadow and danger, when the assumption that everyone was potentially an enemy was not paranoia but prudent risk assessment. His personal life during these years was sparse and unsatisfying. He married twice, both times to women who died young, the first from illness, the second possibly from suicide, unable to endure life with a man who could show no tenderness, who treated family as he treated comrades, with suspicion and demands for absolute loyalty. He had children he barely acknowledged, who grew up knowing their father as a distant figure whose approval was unattainable and whose displeasure was terrifying. The capacity for love that had allowed the young Soso to write poetry had been so thoroughly suppressed that it seemed to no longer exist, replaced by a coldness that extended to everyone, making a genuine human connection impossible. By 1924, when Lenin finally died after years of declining health, Stalin was positioned perfectly for the succession struggle that everyone knew was coming. He was General Secretary, a position that had seemed administrative and unimportant when created, but that Stalin had transformed into the fulcrum of party power. He controlled appointments throughout the bureaucracy, knew everyone's secrets and weaknesses, and had built a machine that made him indispensable to the functioning of the party apparatus. His opponents were more famous, more charismatic, more intellectually impressive. But he had the organization, and in the struggle that followed, the organization would prove more decisive than brilliance. The man who emerged from the shadows into the partial light of Lenin's death was unrecognizable as the boy who had entered the Tiflis seminary 25 years earlier. The poetry was gone. The Georgian accent remained, but the Georgian sensitivity had been burned away entirely. What remained was something harder than steel, colder than the Siberian exile he had endured, more dangerous than any of his rivals understood until it was too late. The revolutionary in the shadows was about to step forward and claim absolute power. And the methods he had learned in the underground, the willingness to use any means, the paranoia that saw enemies everywhere, the conviction that violence was not just acceptable but necessary. These would become not the tactics of insurgency, but the governing principles of a vast state. And the cost, always the cost, was about to be paid not by Stalin, but by millions who would die in the service of his vision, his paranoia, his absolute refusal to accept any limit on his power or any check on his will. The shadows were receding. The full horror of what he would do with the power he had so patiently accumulated was about to be revealed, and the world would learn that revolutions, even socialist revolutions that promised liberation and equality, could produce tyranny as absolute as anything the old regime had achieved, could create systems of oppression that made the Tsar's repressions seem almost benign by comparison. The night deepens over this dark history, and we prepare to watch as Stalin transforms from underground revolutionary into absolute dictator, from someone fighting a system into someone who becomes the system, embodying in his person all the terror and brutality that total power without accountability inevitably produces. Rest briefly if you can. What comes next is darker still. Lenin died on January 21st, 1924, his brain destroyed by the series of strokes that had rendered him progressively more helpless over the previous 2 years. The man who had led the Bolsheviks through revolution and civil war, who had built the Soviet state through will and theory in equal measure, was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum and a party filled with ambitious men who believed themselves his rightful heir. The funeral was a spectacle of manufactured grief, hundreds of thousands filing past the body that would be embalmed and displayed in a mausoleum, transforming the atheist revolutionary into a secular saint, his corpse becoming a relic for pilgrims who would queue for hours to glimpse the founder of the world's first socialist state. Stalin organized the funeral with meticulous care, positioning himself as chief mourner, as the devoted disciple carrying forward the master's work. He delivered a eulogy that was unusual for him, almost religious in its cadences, a series of vows spoken like liturgy. We vow to you, Comrade Lenin, that we will fulfill your commandments. The language was deliberate, appealing to the quasi-religious devotion that many Bolsheviks felt toward their fallen leader, establishing Stalin not as successor, but as custodian of Lenin's legacy, as someone who would preserve rather than innovate, continue rather than transform. It was a masterful performance from someone who rarely performed well in public, his thick Georgian accent and awkward demeanor somehow adding to, rather than detracting from the solemnity of the moment. But behind this public display of grief and continuity, Stalin was already maneuvering with cold calculation. The obvious heir was Leon Trotsky, the brilliant orator who had organized the Red Army, who had written the most important theoretical works after Lenin's, who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But Trotsky had made enemies through his arrogance and his intellectual certainty, had alienated potential allies through his inability to engage in the patient political work that built coalitions and accumulated debts. He believed that his ideas and his historical role would be sufficient, that the party would recognize his superiority and grant him leadership as natural succession. Stalin understood that power did not work this way. He formed a troika with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, two of Lenin's oldest associates, presenting themselves as collective leadership against Trotsky's perceived Bonapartism, his ambition to become military dictator. The three coordinated their attacks, using their control of party apparatus to marginalize Trotsky, to deny him platforms for his speeches, to characterize his positions as deviationist and dangerous. They quoted Lenin against him, using the Testament selectively, mentioning Lenin's criticism of Trotsky while suppressing his warnings about Stalin. The campaign was patient and methodical. Trotsky was removed from his position as Commissar of War in 1925, stripped of his organizational base, and isolated from the levers of power. He fought back with pamphlets and speeches, with brilliant theoretical analyses that explained why his opponents were wrong, why their policies would fail, and why the revolution was being betrayed. But brilliant arguments meant nothing without organizational support. and Stalin controlled the organization. Each time Trotsky appealed to the party membership, he found that the membership voted as Stalin's machine directed, that loyalty flowed to whoever controlled appointments and could reward supporters while punishing dissenters. Once Trotsky was sufficiently weakened, Stalin turned on his allies. Zinoviev and Kamenev had served their purpose, had helped eliminate the most dangerous rival. Now they themselves became obstacles, potential alternative centers of power that Stalin could not tolerate. He formed new alliances with Nikolai Bukharin and the so-called right opposition, using them against the left, accusing Zinoviev and Kamenev of factionalism, of violating party unity, of the same sins they had recently condemned in Trotsky. The pattern was becoming clear to those watching carefully. Stalin did not defeat opponents through ideological superiority or personal charisma. He defeated them by isolating them, by building coalitions that turned former allies against each other, by controlling the administrative machinery that determined who could speak where, who received which information, who advanced, and who stagnated. He was patient, willing to let struggles extend over years, understanding that others would exhaust themselves in ideological debates, while he accumulated bureaucratic power that would outlast any theoretical victory. The party structure that Lenin had built, the democratic centralism that was supposed to allow debate before decisions and unity afterward, was being transformed into a tool of personal rule. Stalin used his position as general secretary to appoint loyalists throughout the hierarchy, creating a network of people who owed their positions to him, who understood that their futures depended on remaining in his favor. He maintained detailed records of every party member's positions and statements, creating archives that could be weaponized against anyone who later proved troublesome, using their own words against them to prove deviation or disloyalty. By 1927, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev had been expelled from the party entirely, an unprecedented action against founding members of the Bolshevik movement. Trotsky would be exiled from the Soviet Union in 1929, beginning a wandering existence that would end with his assassination in Mexico in 1940, murdered by a Soviet agent who drove an ice axe into his skull. But even from exile, Trotsky understood what was happening, wrote devastating analyses of how the revolution was being betrayed, how bureaucratic degeneration was creating a new ruling class, how Stalin was building a personal dictatorship that had nothing to do with socialism or workers' power. These warnings went largely unheeded. The international communist movement followed Moscow's lead, accepted Stalin's characterization of Trotsky as a traitor and deviationist, purged Trotskyists from their ranks with the same thoroughness that Stalin was purging them from the Soviet Union. The man who had organized the Red Army victory in the Civil War became an unperson, his contributions erased from official histories. His name mentioned only as an example of what happened to those who opposed the party line, which increasingly meant opposing Stalin personally. With the left opposition destroyed, Stalin turned his attention to his former allies on the right. Bukharin had served his purpose, had helped defeat Zinoviev and Kamenev, had provided theoretical justification for the moderate economic policies Stalin had temporarily adopted. But Stalin's patience with moderation was exhausted. He wanted rapid industrialization, forced collectivization of agriculture, a total transformation of Soviet society that the right opposition argued was too extreme, too costly in human terms, and economically unsound. The arguments about economic policy masked deeper struggles about power. Bukharin represented the last significant alternative to Stalin's personal rule, commanded respect among party intellectuals, and offered a different vision of Soviet development that was gradualist rather than catastrophic. Stalin needed to eliminate this alternative, to close off any possibility that the party might choose a different path, might limit his power, or check his increasingly grandiose plans. The campaign against Bukharin was brutal and personal. Stalin accused him of being soft on kulaks, the supposedly wealthy peasants who were blamed for agricultural problems. He characterized Bukharin's economic moderation as right deviationism, as capitulation to capitalist elements, as betrayal of revolutionary principles. The attacks were unfair and often incoherent, but they did not need to be fair or coherent. They needed only to be repeated sufficiently to create the impression that Bukharin was unreliable, potentially disloyal, someone whose positions endangered the revolution and therefore the Soviet state. By 1929, Bukharin had been defeated, removed from his positions, and reduced to making humiliating confessions of error before party bodies that showed him no mercy. The process that would be refined during the Great Purges was already visible here. The demand for confession, the ritualized self criticism, and the understanding that acknowledging error was not enough to earn forgiveness, but merely the price of avoiding worse punishment. Bukharin confessed and was allowed to live, for now. Others in the right opposition suffered various fates, removed from power, exiled to administrative posts in distant provinces, marked as politically unreliable in ways that would later become death sentences. Stalin now stood alone atop the Soviet hierarchy. Every potential rival had been eliminated or broken. The party that had once contained fierce debates and genuine ideological diversity had been transformed into an instrument of his will, where disagreement was deviation and deviation was crime. The Central Committee and Politburo continued to meet, continued to pass resolutions and make decisions, but everyone understood that they were ratifying Stalin's decisions rather than making their own, that the forms of collective leadership persisted while the reality was dictatorship. The cult of personality was being constructed with systematic deliberation. Stalin's 50th birthday in December 1929 was celebrated with an extravagance that would have embarrassed earlier Bolshevik leaders, parades and speeches, and publications praising his genius and his leadership, transforming the crude Georgian revolutionary into the embodiment of socialist virtue and Soviet power. His image appeared everywhere, portraits and statues multiplying across the vast Soviet territory, his name attached to cities and factories and collective farms, the man of steel becoming omnipresent in ways that suggested not a political leader but a secular god. The propaganda was relentless and sophisticated, using all the tools of modern media to create the impression of a leader who was simultaneously accessible and transcendent, who understood ordinary people's struggles while possessing wisdom beyond their comprehension, who embodied the revolution and the nation in his person. Children were taught to love him as they might love a father. Workers were told that their increased productivity was a personal gift to him. Soldiers marched into battle shouting his name. The psychological effect was to make opposition feel not just politically dangerous but personally disloyal, a betrayal of someone who cared for you, who had sacrificed for the revolution, who deserved your absolute devotion in return. But beneath the propaganda and the personality cult was a simpler reality: fear. Stalin had demonstrated through the elimination of every rival that opposition was futile and dangerous, that even old Bolsheviks, founding members of the party, veterans of the revolution and civil war, could be destroyed if they challenged him. The message was clear to everyone who was paying attention. Survival required absolute loyalty, required anticipating his wishes rather than waiting for orders, and required demonstrating enthusiasm for his policies regardless of what you privately believed. The party was being transformed from a revolutionary vanguard into an administrative apparatus for implementing one man's will. The Soviets that gave the state its name, the workers' councils that were supposed to embody direct democracy, became rubber stamps for decisions made elsewhere. The trade unions that were supposed to protect workers became instruments for extracting more labor. Every institution was being hollowed out, its original purpose replaced with a single function: extending Stalin's control over every aspect of Soviet life. And yet, to many both inside and outside the Soviet Union, this seemed acceptable, even necessary. The country faced enormous challenges. Hostile capitalist powers surrounded it. Internal enemies, real and imagined, threatened to sabotage the socialist experiment. In such circumstances, strong leadership seemed prudent, even essential. The cost of that strength, the concentration of power in one man's hands, the elimination of checks and alternatives, this could be justified as temporary, as necessary for survival until the external threats diminished and the internal transformation was complete. This was the lie that enabled what came next. Because the power Stalin had accumulated was not temporary and would not be relinquished voluntarily. The controls he had established would not be relaxed when threats diminished, but would be intensified, turned inward against the very party that had created them. The methods he had refined in eliminating political rivals would be applied wholesale to the entire population, creating terror on a scale that made the succession struggle seem almost gentle by comparison. By 1929, the rise to absolute power was complete. The Georgian boy who had written poetry, the seminary student who had become a revolutionary, the underground organizer who had robbed banks and evaded police, the political operator who had patiently outlasted more brilliant rivals. All these versions had led to this moment when Joseph Stalin controlled the Soviet Union as completely as any Tsar had ever controlled Russia, commanded power that was limited only by his own imagination and willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. And those limits, it would soon become horrifically clear, did not exist. The man who had shown no mercy to rivals would show none to anyone. The methods that had worked in political struggle would be applied to entire classes of people. The paranoia that had served him well in the underground would metastasize into a worldview where enemies existed everywhere, and vigilance required permanent terror. The revolution that had promised liberation would deliver tyranny. The socialism that had promised equality would create hierarchies as rigid as anything under capitalism. And the man at the apex of this system would preside over crimes that made the Tsarist regime he had fought seem almost benign. The transformation was complete. The rise was over. What remained was the exercise of absolute power, unrestrained by law or morality or human compassion, directed by a paranoia that would eventually consume millions, driven by a will that recognized no limits and a conviction that any cost could be justified if it served the goal of building socialism in one country, regardless of how many had to die for that building to proceed. The night grows darker still, and in that darkness, we must now witness what unlimited power does when wielded by someone whose humanity has been so thoroughly suppressed that millions of deaths become mere statistics, acceptable costs, necessary sacrifices to a vision that justified everything and explained nothing except the capacity of human beings to inflict suffering on scales that defy comprehension. Rest briefly before we descend into the terror. What comes next? Test the limits of what can be spoken in bedtime tones, what can be acknowledged without destroying the possibility of a sleep. But it must be told, because forgetting serves only those who would repeat such crimes. And so we continue into the famine and the purges, into the heart of darkness that was Stalin's Soviet Union in the 1930s. The grain stood in the fields, golden and ready for harvest. The autumn of 1932 promising abundance that might finally ease the hunger that had plagued Ukraine through the previous year. But the harvest would not feed those who had grown it. Orders had come from Moscow, quotas that had to be met regardless of what remained for the farmers themselves, demands that grain be delivered to the state, even if that meant the villages would starve. And starve they did, millions of them, in a famine that was not a natural disaster, but policy, not accident, but deliberate tool of political transformation and national punishment. Stalin's collectivization campaign had begun in 1929, a massive reorganization of Soviet agriculture that aimed to replace individual peasant farming with collective farms controlled by the state. The official justification was efficiency and socialist principle, the pooling of land and equipment to create economies of scale, and the elimination of the kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants who exploited others. The reality was control and extraction, the need to feed rapidly industrializing cities rapidly while breaking the independence of a peasantry that Stalin viewed as inherently reactionary, as the social base for potential resistance to his rule. The campaign was implemented with catastrophic brutality. Peasants who resisted collectivization were declared kulaks regardless of their actual wealth, arrested, deported to labor camps, or executed outright. Millions were uprooted from lands their families had worked for generations, sent to Siberia and Kazakhstan, where survival was uncertain and infrastructure to support them was non existent. Those who remained were forced onto collective farms where they worked for the state rather than themselves, where their livestock and tools were seized, and where the logic of individual incentive was replaced with quotas and punishments for failing to meet them. The peasants resisted in whatever ways they could. They slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender them to the collectives, reasoning that if they could not keep the animals, at least they could eat them. They hid grain, buried it in pits and wells, hoping to preserve something for their families when the state had taken its share. They fled to cities where, at least, there was food from state stores, abandoning villages that had existed for centuries. The resistance was desperate and largely ineffective, crushed by NKVD troops who treated it as counter-revolution requiring exemplary violence. In Ukraine, particularly, the famine became genocidal in its impact. The region was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, its fertile black soil producing grain that fed much of the country. But Stalin suspected Ukrainian nationalism, feared that peasant resistance to collectivization was merging with a desire for independence, and decided that both problems could be solved through starvation. The grain quotas assigned to Ukraine were impossible to meet while leaving enough for subsistence. When they were not met, additional quotas were imposed as punishment. When those were not met, brigades were sent to confiscate everything edible, searching houses and barns, digging up gardens, taking seed grain that was meant for the next planting. By the winter of 1932, villages across Ukraine were experiencing famine that moved beyond hunger into absolute catastrophe. People ate bark and grass, boiled leather to extract whatever nutrition it might contain, consumed their pets, and then animals they caught in increasingly desperate searches for anything that could be eaten. Children with swollen bellies and matchstick limbs wandered roads looking for help that was not coming. The elderly died first, then the young, then those of working age, those who should have been strongest but whose bodies had no reserves left to draw upon. The Soviet state knew what was happening. Reports reached Moscow detailing the dying, the abandoned villages, the corpses in the streets of cities where peasants had fled, hoping for food. Stalin's response was to seal Ukraine's borders, to prevent the starving from escaping, to classify information about the famine as a state secret, and to continue extracting grain while people died of starvation literally within sight of the grain being loaded onto trains for export abroad. The deaths were not incidental to policy but its purpose, the breaking of the Ukrainian peasantry as an independent force, the terrorizing of the entire Soviet population into understanding that resistance to collectivization would be met with starvation. The estimates of dead vary, but most historians agree that between 3 and 5 million people died in the Ukrainian famine, known as the Holodomor, from 1932 to 1933. Some villages lost half their population. In some regions, a third of the people died. The survivors were traumatized beyond what psychology had language to describe, living for years with memories of watching their children die, of being too weak to bury their parents, of the moral destruction that came from making choices about who would eat and who would not when there was not enough for anyone. And this was not the only famine. Kazakhstan suffered proportionally worse, losing perhaps a third of its population as nomadic peoples were forced into collectivization that destroyed their traditional way of life and provided no viable alternative. Russia itself experienced hunger, though less severe than in the periphery. The Soviet Union in the early 1930s was a landscape of death where the state's economic policies killed millions through a combination of callousness and deliberate cruelty, where the push to industrialize required extracting resources from the countryside regardless of the human cost, and where building socialism apparently required the sacrifice of those whose labor made that building possible. Stalin's response to reports of famine was to deny its existence, to blame kulak sabotage, and to characterize those who spoke of starvation as enemies, spreading lies to discredit the Soviet Union. When international observers and journalists tried to investigate, they were shown model collective farms, given tours of functioning kitchens, and told that reports of famine were Western propaganda. Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Moscow, infamously wrote that there was no famine while millions died, winning a Pulitzer Prize for reportage that was either willfully blind or deliberately deceptive, serving Stalin's interests rather than truth. But the famine, terrible as it was only the beginning of the 1930s horrors. In 1934, Sergei Kirov, the Leningrad party boss and potential rival to Stalin, was assassinated in circumstances that remain murky, but that Stalin immediately used as justification for intensified repression. Whether Stalin ordered the killing or simply exploited it opportunistically, the result was the same. The murder became the pretext for the Great Terror, for purges that would consume the party, the military, the intelligentsia, and eventually millions of ordinary Soviet citizens whose only crime was existing in a state where quotas for arrests had to be met, and innocence was no defense. The purges began at the top, with show trials of old Bolsheviks accused of fantastic conspiracies. Zinoviev and Kamenev, already defeated and marginalized, were arrested and tried in 1936 for supposedly plotting to assassinate Stalin and restore capitalism. The evidence was absurd. Confessions extracted through torture and threats to family members, testimony that contradicted itself and violated basic logic. But the trials were not about establishing guilt through evidence. They were performances designed to demonstrate that even the most devoted revolutionaries could betray the cause, that vigilance was required against enemies who hid behind masks of loyalty, that Stalin alone could be trusted. The defendants confessed to crimes they had not committed, implicated others who would then be arrested and forced to confess in turn, creating cascading waves of arrests that spread through every institution. Bukharin was tried in 1938, the last of the major figures from Lenin's time, forced to confess to being a wrecker and a spy, to having plotted with Trotsky and foreign powers to destroy the Soviet Union. He confessed, knowing that refusal would mean torture, not just for himself but for his family, that cooperation might at least spare his wife and infant son, even if it could not save him. All the major defendants in the show trials were executed. But the purges extended far beyond famous old Bolsheviks. The military was decapitated, thousands of officers arrested and shot on charges of espionage and conspiracy, including some of the most capable commanders who would be desperately needed when war came. The NKVD itself was purged, each wave of arrests conducted by secret police who would themselves be arrested in the next wave, creating a terrible irony where the executioners became victims of the machinery they had served. The mechanism of terror was bureaucratic in its efficiency. Quotas were assigned to each region, numerical targets for how many enemies of the people should be arrested. Local NKVD offices competed to exceed their quotas, demonstrating enthusiasm and vigilance by arresting more than required. People were arrested based on denunciations, anonymous or coerced, based on class background or past associations, based on nothing except the need to fill quotas. The arrested were tortured until they confessed and implicated others, creating networks of conspiracy that existed only in the imaginations of interrogators and the coerced testimony of the tortured. The sentences came in categories. The first category meant execution carried out in basement rooms of NKVD headquarters, prisoners shot in the back of the head and buried in mass graves that would not be discovered for decades. The second category meant the Gulag, the vast network of labor camps spread across Siberia and the far north, where prisoners worked on construction projects and resource extraction under conditions designed more to punish than to utilize their labor effectively. The camps killed through exhaustion, cold, starvation, and the casual violence of guards who understood that prisoners were enemies of the people and therefore deserving of no mercy. The statistics are numbing in their immensity. During the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938, approximately 750,000 people were executed. Nearly 2 million were sent to camps. These numbers are conservative estimates. The real totals may be higher, and these figures cover only the peak years of the terror. Across Stalin's entire rule, from the late 1920s through his death in 1953, the number of people who died in camps, executions, deportations, and engineered famines ranges from estimates of 10 million to 20 million or more. The exact figure will never be known because records were destroyed. After all, many deaths were never recorded. After all, the machinery of killing operated at scales that overwhelmed the bureaucracy's capacity to document it. But numbers, even millions, obscure more than they reveal. Each death was a person, someone with hopes and fears, family and friends, a life that was unique and irreplaceable. Maria Nikolaevna was a teacher in Moscow, 40 years old, arrested in 1937 because a student reported that she had criticized a textbook's historical account. She was tortured for 3 days until she confessed to being a Trotskyist agent, implicated 5 colleagues whom she named because the interrogator demanded names, and she could no longer endure the pain. She was executed 2 weeks after her arrest. Her husband was arrested next, and her children were sent to an orphanage where they were taught to denounce their parents as enemies of the people. Ivan Petrovich was a factory worker in Leningrad, a party member since 1917, someone who had fought in the Civil War and been wounded defending the revolution. He was arrested because someone who was arrested mentioned his name under torture. He refused to confess, maintained his innocence through months of interrogation, and believed that the party would recognize the mistake and release him. Instead, he was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag, sent to a camp in Kolyma, where he died within a year of malnutrition and overwork, his body thrown into an unmarked pit with dozens of others who had died that week. Yelena Alexandrovna was a peasant woman in Ukraine, 30 years old with 3 children, arrested for hoarding grain, which meant she had hidden a sack of wheat to feed her family after state requisitions had taken everything else. She was sentenced to 5 years separated from her children, who she would never see again, sent to a camp where she worked cutting timber in conditions so severe that her hands were permanently damaged by frostbite. She survived and returned home in 1942 to find her village destroyed, her children dead or scattered, her life reduced to memories of what had been lost. These stories, and millions like them, were the reality beneath the statistics, the human cost of Stalin's terror that could not be adequately captured in numbers or categories. The machinery of repression operated with such scope and speed that it created a society living in constant fear, where every conversation was dangerous, every friendship potential betrayal, where the knock on the door at night became the sound of absolute dread, because it might mean arrest, disappearance, death, or something worse than death, because at least the dead stopped suffering while those in camps endured years of slow destruction. Stalin presided over this system with apparent detachment, signing execution lists while eating dinner, approving quotas for arrests as if they were production targets, showing no visible emotion at the destruction of people who had been colleagues and comrades. The paranoia that had served him in rising to power had become a total worldview where enemies existed everywhere, where even the most loyal could not be trusted, where the only safety lay in eliminating anyone who might potentially pose a threat before they could act on that potential. But there was method in the madness. The terror served purposes beyond Stalin's paranoia. It atomized Soviet society, destroyed any possibility of collective resistance by making everyone suspicious of everyone else, by creating a system where denouncing others became self protection, where showing insufficient enthusiasm for the purges could make you the next victim. It consolidated control by replacing anyone whose loyalty might be questionable with new cadres who owed everything to Stalin, who understood that their positions depended entirely on remaining in his favor. It created a population so traumatized and terrified that obedience became automatic, that the very thought of resistance became unthinkable, and perhaps most terrifyingly, many who participated in the terror believed they were serving justice, defending the revolution against enemies who truly existed, even if the specific charges against specific individuals were fabricated. The ideology was so powerful, the propaganda so pervasive, that people could torture confessions out of innocence while believing they were uncovering real conspiracies, could execute colleagues while thinking they were protecting socialism, could send millions to camps while convinced that this was necessary for building the future. The system did not require everyone to be cynical. It could function with true believers who thought the horror they inflicted served noble purposes. By 1939, when the Great Terror finally subsided not from moral awakening but from exhaustion and the recognition that destroying too much of the administrative and military apparatus threatened the state's functioning, the Soviet Union had been transformed into something unprecedented in human history. Not just a dictatorship which had existed before, but a totalitarian state where every aspect of life was subject to political control, where privacy did not exist, where the boundary between public and private had been dissolved, where the state claimed authority over not just actions, but thoughts, where crimes could be retroactive and guilt could be assigned by association. Stalin had won completely. Every rival was dead or broken. Every institution was under his control. Every Soviet citizen understood that survival required absolute obedience and visible enthusiasm for whatever policy was currently in force. The man of steel had remade the Soviet Union in his image, creating a system that would outlast him, that would continue terrorizing its population even after his death, that would demonstrate how thoroughly revolution could betray its promises, how completely socialism could become a totalitarian nightmare. The night is darkest now, and we must rest before the final chapter, before we trace Stalin through the war that would test everything he had built, through the victory that would vindicate in his mind the methods he had used, through his final paranoid years, and the death that would finally end his reign, but could not resurrect his millions of victims or undo the trauma he had inflicted on generations. Sleep, if you can, carrying the weight of these histories, these millions of individual tragedies that should never be reduced to statistics, that must be remembered as human beings who deserved better than the system that consumed them. Tomorrow we conclude this unforgivable life, this descent into darkness that helps us understand, not to excuse, that shows us what unchecked power does when wielded by someone whose capacity for empathy has been destroyed, whose paranoia has become systematic policy, whose will encounters no limit except those imposed by physical reality itself. Rest now. The worst has been told. What remains is the aftermath and legacy, and the question of what we learn from the ruins of utopias built on bones. The message arrived at the Kremlin in the early morning hours of June 22nd, 1941, reports flooding in from along the western frontier. That German forces had crossed the border in massive strength, that the Wehrmacht was driving deep into Soviet territory with speed and power that suggested not limited action but total war. Stalin refused to believe it initially, insisted it must be provocation, unauthorized action by local commanders, anything except what it obviously was, the invasion he had been warned about repeatedly, that his own intelligence services had predicted, that he had ignored because accepting it would mean admitting his calculations had been catastrophically wrong. He had signed the non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939, shocking the world and his own party, allying with the fascist regime that socialism was supposed to oppose. Buying time, he said, for the Soviet Union to prepare for the inevitable conflict. But he had also believed, or wanted to believe, that Hitler would not attack while still fighting Britain, that the pact would hold at least until the war in the West was resolved, that he had more time to rebuild the military he had destroyed through purges that had executed or imprisoned the officers who would now be desperately needed. The first weeks of the invasion were catastrophic beyond anything the purges had inflicted. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Cities fell within days. The Germans advanced so quickly that Soviet forces could not establish defensive lines, could not coordinate resistance, could not even retreat in good order. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured, their equipment abandoned or destroyed, and the Western territories that Stalin had annexed through the pact with Hitler were lost almost immediately to the German blitzkrieg. Stalin disappeared from public view for nearly 2 weeks, reportedly suffering a nervous breakdown at his dacha, unable to process the magnitude of the disaster, the realization that his purges had weakened the military to the point where it could barely function, that his pact with Hitler had bought not preparation time but false security. When he finally addressed the nation on July 3rd, his voice over the radio was different from the confident pronouncements of the past, carrying a vulnerability that Soviet citizens had never heard from their leader. He called them brothers and sisters, friends, admitted that grave danger faced the motherland, and asked for their support in what would be called the Great Patriotic War. The response was remarkable. Despite everything Stalin had done to them, despite the purges and the famines and the terror, millions of Soviet citizens rallied to defend their country, not necessarily because they loved Stalin, but because they loved Russia, because the Germans were proving even more brutal than the Soviet state. After all, surrender meant slavery or death, and fighting at least offered the possibility of survival. The war became a genuine popular struggle in ways the revolution had never quite achieved. The Soviet people enduring horrors that would have broken less desperate nations. The siege of Leningrad began in September 1941 and would last for 872 days, nearly 2.5 years, during which the city was cut off from supply lines, subjected to constant bombardment, slowly starving as food ran out, and winter descended with particular brutality. People ate wallpaper paste and leather belts, boiled sawdust to extract whatever nutrition it might contain, and died by the hundreds of thousands from starvation, cold, and disease that thrived in the dying city. But Leningrad did not surrender, its defenders fighting block by block, its citizens maintaining some semblance of normal life even as death became routine, as bodies lay in streets because the living lacked the strength to bury them. At Stalingrad in 1942, the battle that would become the war's turning point, Soviet and German forces fought for months over ruins that had been reduced to rubble by artillery and air bombardment, fighting building to building, room to room, sometimes floor to floor in the same destroyed structures. The casualties were staggering on both sides. Stalin issued Order 227, not one step back, forbidding retreat under penalty of execution, placing blocking detachments behind frontline units with orders to shoot anyone who fell back without authorization. The order was brutal but effective, or perhaps the brutality was the effectiveness. Soldiers understanding that death in battle was certain only if they retreated, while fighting at least offered the possibility of survival. The tide turned at Stalingrad when Soviet forces encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping it in the city it had tried to capture. The Germans fought on for months, hoping for relief that never came, finally surrendering in February 1943. The survivors marching into captivity from which most would never return. The victory was enormously costly, perhaps 1 million Soviet casualties, but it broke the Wehrmacht's offensive capability, proved that the Germans could be defeated, shifted the psychological balance of the war from desperation to hope. Stalin's wartime leadership was a mixture of catastrophic errors and effective ruthlessness. His insistence on defending every inch of Soviet territory led to unnecessary encirclements and casualties in the war's early phase. His interference in military operations sometimes contradicted sound tactical judgment, his paranoia making him suspicious of generals who showed too much competence or independence. But he also learned to delegate more than he had during peacetime, to allow capable commanders like Zhukov to plan and execute operations without constant interference, to focus his attention on strategic decisions and let professionals handle tactics. He was pitiless toward anything that might weaken the war effort. Entire populations were deported on suspicion of potential collaboration with Germans, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and others were forcibly relocated to Central Asia in conditions that killed tens of thousands. Soviet prisoners of war who survived German captivity were treated as traitors, sent to camps rather than welcomed home, and punished for the crime of having been captured. The families of soldiers who were captured were penalized, their rations reduced, their relatives dismissed from jobs, and guilt by association applied even to those who had no control over battlefield outcomes. The Soviet economy was reorganized entirely for war production. Factories dismantled and moved east beyond German reach. Workers laboring in conditions that would have been unacceptable in peacetime, but that were accepted now because the alternative was German occupation. Women replaced men in factories and fields, worked 12 and 14-hour shifts, and maintained production while enduring shortages and hardships that made pre-war poverty seem almost comfortable by comparison. The Soviet state demonstrated a capacity for total mobilization that few had believed possible, channeling every resource toward the single purpose of defeating Germany. The turning point came at Kursk in summer 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where the German offensive was broken against prepared Soviet defenses and counteroffensives that began pushing westward, slowly reclaiming territory that had been lost, moving inexorably toward Germany itself. The advance was not smooth or cheap. Every mile was contested, German forces fighting desperate defensive battles, but the outcome was increasingly clear. The Wehrmacht was being ground down by Soviet numerical superiority and by the industrial capacity that was producing tanks, aircraft, and munitions faster than Germany could replace its losses. By 1944, Soviet forces had liberated most of their territory, and were pushing into Eastern Europe, encountering populations whose reactions ranged from welcome to hostility depending on their previous experiences and their expectations about what Soviet occupation would mean. The Red Army's behavior was often brutal, with rape and looting widespread, and discipline breaking down in units that had endured years of desperate combat and that took revenge on civilian populations for crimes committed by German forces. Stalin did little to prevent this, viewing it as an understandable if regrettable response to years of suffering, as the price Germany and its allies would pay for invading the Soviet Union. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Soviet forces capturing Berlin, raising the red flag over the Reichstag in a moment of triumph that seemed to vindicate everything, all the suffering and sacrifice, all the costs that had been paid. The Great Patriotic War killed perhaps 27 million Soviet citizens, the exact figure unknown because chaos and destruction made accurate counting impossible. Entire villages had been destroyed, cities lay in ruins. The Western territories that had borne the brunt of fighting would take decades to recover. But the Soviet Union had survived, and its army stood in the heart of Europe, a superpower that had defeated the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. Stalin emerged from the war with his position stronger than ever. The victory seemed to prove that his methods had been necessary, that the industrialization and the purges and the terror had built a state capable of withstanding the German onslaught, that his leadership had been vindicated by results that could not be argued with. The suffering of the war years overshadowed the suffering of the pre-war period. The enemy that had threatened total annihilation, making Stalin's earlier crimes seem almost acceptable by comparison, at least to those desperate to find meaning in the millions of deaths. The post-war settlement extended Soviet control over Eastern Europe, creating a buffer zone of satellite states that would be governed according to Stalin's model, which would experience their own versions of collectivization and purges, and the crushing of any independence or alternative to Communist Party rule. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany all became Soviet satellites, their political systems reorganized, their economies integrated into Soviet planning, their populations subjected to the same controls and terrors that Soviet citizens had endured for decades. The Iron Curtain descended, Churchill's phrase capturing the division of Europe into two hostile blocs, the beginning of the Cold War that would define global politics for the next half century. Stalin positioned the Soviet Union as the leader of the socialist world, as a rival to American capitalism, as the alternative model of development that claimed to offer justice and equality while delivering oppression that was total and inescapable. The wartime alliance with Britain and America dissolved into mutual suspicion and hostility, both sides viewing the other as an existential threat, both beginning arms races that would eventually threaten the entire planet with nuclear annihilation. But victory did not bring peace to the Soviet Union internally. Stalin's paranoia, which had never truly abated even during the war, intensified in his final years. He was aging, his health declining, his suspicions growing more irrational and dangerous. He saw conspiracies everywhere, imagined that his closest associates were plotting against him, that even those who had served him faithfully for decades could not be trusted. The Leningrad affair in 1949 saw the purging of party officials from that city, arrests, and executions based on manufactured charges. The doctor's plot in 1952 accused Jewish physicians of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders, an anti Semitic campaign that was preparing ground for new purges that might have rivaled the terror of the 1930s. His subordinates lived in constant fear. Meetings with Stalin were ordeals where any word might be interpreted as disloyalty, where showing too much competence might mark you as a threat, where the aging dictator's moods determined whether you left as a trusted associate or marked for destruction. Lavrenti Beria, who had run the NKVD and supervised the terror, was himself terrified of Stalin and understood that his knowledge of secrets and his capacity for violence made him particularly vulnerable if Stalin decided he had become too powerful or too dangerous. The system Stalin had built was eating itself again. The wartime relaxation of terror was ending, the controls tightening, the machinery of repression preparing to resume operations on scales that the war's aftermath had temporarily interrupted. Soviet citizens who had hoped that victory might bring liberalization, that the sacrifices of war might earn them relief from political control, found instead that Stalin's grip was tightening, that survival of the war meant only that they would endure more years under a dictatorship that showed no signs of moderating or allowing any space for autonomy or dissent. Then, on March 1st, 1953, Stalin suffered a stroke. He was at his dacha, had been meeting with Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and others the night before, had dismissed them and gone to his room. When he did not emerge the next morning, the guards were afraid to check on him, knowing that entering without permission could mean punishment. Hours passed before anyone dared to investigate, finding him collapsed on the floor, partially paralyzed, unable to speak. The man who had controlled everything suddenly helpless. The delay in treatment may have been fatal, may have been deliberate. His subordinates' understanding was that his death would liberate them from the fear that had governed their lives for decades. Or perhaps they simply panicked, unable to decide what to do, terrified of making the wrong decision even in an emergency. Medical help was eventually summoned, but the doctors who arrived were themselves terrified, aware that Stalin had just been preparing to purge the medical profession, that treating him carried risks regardless of outcome. He died on March 5th, 1953, 4 days after the stroke, without regaining consciousness or speech, his final hours witnessed by associates who showed grief publicly while likely feeling relief privately. The man who had ruled for nearly 30 years, who had transformed the Soviet Union from an agricultural backwater into an industrial superpower, who had defeated Nazi Germany and built an empire that stretched from Berlin to Vladivostok, who had killed millions of his own citizens and terrorized hundreds of millions more, was gone. The funeral was an event of forced mass grief, hundreds of thousands gathering in Moscow to view the body, to mourn a leader many feared and few loved, but who had defined their entire adult lives, whose death created uncertainty about what would come next. The grief was real for some. Those who genuinely believed Stalin had been a great leader, who accepted propaganda about his genius and his devotion to the people. For others, the mourning was a performance, a necessary display to avoid suspicion in the uncertain transition period before new leadership consolidated power. Beria was arrested and executed within months, his knowledge of secrets and his capacity for violence making him too dangerous to allow to live now that Stalin's protection was gone. Khrushchev would emerge as Stalin's eventual successor, would deliver the secret speech in 1956, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and some of his crimes, beginning the process of de-Stalinization that would never be complete, which would be constantly fought by those who had benefited from or believed in Stalin's system. The legacy was complicated beyond any simple assessment. Stalin had industrialized the Soviet Union, transforming it from an agrarian society into an industrial power capable of defeating Germany and rivaling America. But the industrialization had been achieved through methods that killed millions, through forced labor and terror that transformed a tragedy as much as an achievement. He had defeated fascism, the Soviet Union's sacrifices in World War II, saving Europe from Nazi domination. But he had created his own totalitarian system that was different in ideology, but similar in practice to what he had defeated, that oppressed and murdered on scales that rivaled Hitler's crimes. He had proven that socialism could be totalitarian, that revolution could betray its promises, that the dictatorship of the proletariat could become dictatorship over the proletariat, that systems built to liberate could enslave more thoroughly than what they replaced. The great experiment in building communism had produced not the workers' paradise that Marx had envisioned, but a nightmare state where human life was valued only for its utility to the plan, where millions died in service to industrialization that was supposed to serve them, where the future that was being built required the sacrifice of the present in ways that made the future's achievement almost meaningless given what had been destroyed to reach it. And the question that haunts us still is not just how Stalin became what he became, though that journey from poverty in Gori to absolute power in the Kremlin contains lessons about how suffering does not ennoble, how violence learned in childhood can metastasize into violence wielded against millions, how revolutionary idealism can harden into bureaucratic terror. The question is also how so many participated, how millions implemented policies they must have known were killing innocents, how the machinery of terror operated with such efficiency across such vast territory, how ordinary people became executioners and interrogators and camp guards who inflicted suffering without apparent hesitation or remorse. The answer is complex and uncomfortable. Some believed genuinely in the ideology, thought they were building socialism, and that the costs were necessary and justified. Some were terrified, participated to avoid becoming victims themselves, understanding that refusal meant joining the condemned. Some were corrupted by power, found that having authority over others' lives was intoxicating, that cruelty could be satisfying when it was sanctioned and rewarded. And some were simply following orders, doing their jobs, not thinking too hard about the larger meaning because thinking was dangerous and survival required focusing on immediate tasks rather than moral implications. Stalin's life demonstrates what happens when power concentrates absolutely in one person's hands, when no institutions exist to check that power, when ideology justifies any action regardless of its human cost, when paranoia becomes policy and fear becomes the organizing principle of society. It shows us that socialism is not inherently liberating, that revolution can produce tyranny, that the road to hell is indeed paved with intentions that may have started as good, but that led through compromises and cruelties to destinations that bear no resemblance to the destinations that were promised. But it also shows us something about human resilience, about the capacity to survive conditions that should have been unsurvivable, about the persistence of decency in circumstances designed to destroy it. The Soviet people who endured Stalin's rule and Hitler's invasion, who rebuilt their country from the ruins and maintained some core of humanity despite everything done to crush it, who found ways to care for each other and preserve memory and resist, in small ways that could not prevent the terror but could at least maintain the sense that the terror was wrong. These people demonstrated strengths that should not have been necessary but that were necessary and that somehow proved sufficient. As this unforgivable life draws to its close, we are left not with easy answers but with the weight of history, with the recognition that the 20th century produced horrors on scales previously unimaginable, and that Stalin was among the primary architects of those horrors. His crimes cannot be undone, his victims cannot be resurrected. The trauma he inflicted on Soviet society persisted for generations after his death. The habits of fear and suspicion, the difficulty trusting authorities or each other, the sense that catastrophe could arrive without warning and destroy everything you had built. And yet, we must remember, must study this terrible history, not to become paralyzed by it, but to learn from it, to recognize the warning signs when power concentrates, when ideology becomes rigid, when leaders demand absolute loyalty and dissent is criminalized, when the end is allowed to justify any means, and human life becomes raw material for grand projects rather than the purpose that projects should serve. Stalin's life teaches us that such systems can be built, that millions can die in the building, that the results can persist for decades and spread across continents. But it also teaches us that such systems eventually collapse, that lies cannot be sustained indefinitely, that terror creates the conditions for its own eventual undoing, even if that undoing comes too late for the millions already dead. The Soviet Union that Stalin built survived his death by less than 40 years, fell not to external conquest, but to internal exhaustion, to the impossibility of maintaining the fiction that the system worked when every Soviet citizen could see that it did not, that the promises remained unfulfilled, that the costs kept accumulating without end. The night has carried us through this darkest of biographies, through poverty and revolution and the rise to power, through famine and terror and war and final paranoia. We have witnessed a life that should teach us caution about concentrating power, about believing that ends justify means, and about trusting leaders who claim infallibility and demand absolute obedience. We have seen what happens when one person's will becomes law for millions, when checks and balances are eliminated, when fear becomes the primary mechanism of governance. And now we rest, carrying these lessons forward, understanding that the capacity for such evil exists wherever conditions allow it, that preventing such horrors requires eternal vigilance, that freedom is fragile and totalitarianism is always possible if we forget why limits on power matter, why dissent must be protected, why human life must be valued as end rather than means, why the future cannot be built through the sacrifice of all who might live to see it. Sleep now if this history allows sleep, knowing that we remember not to glorify or to wallow in horror, but to understand, to recognize, to ensure that the names of millions who died are not forgotten, that their deaths meant something, if only as a warning, that we who inherit this history bear responsibility for ensuring it is not repeated. Stalin is dead. The millions he killed remain dead. But the questions they raise, the warnings they embody, these live on, asking us what we will do with our power, how we will organize our societies, whether we will learn from the past or be condemned to repeat its darkest chapters. Rest now, remember, and resolve that never again means something more than empty words, that it requires active defense of the principles that make tyranny difficult and freedom possible, that it demands we recognize danger before it becomes unstoppable. The unforgivable life is over. May we build forgivable ones. If this examination of one of history's darkest figures has helped you understand how evil operates at the scale of states, how ideology can justify atrocity, and how unchecked power corrupts absolutely, share this reflection with others who seek to understand, not to excuse, but to prevent, and tell us in the quiet space below which other difficult chapters of history we should explore together, which other warnings from the past we need to remember in the present.